For chair of
Yes,
the
of
symphony.
course.
Good evening.
John Corigliano, Shirley Hellsberg.
On behalf of
For
the
years,
Board
I'll
of
tell you
Art
all about
Trustees
She has for years and years.
and the entire staff of the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art, it is my pleasure to welcome all of you tonight. I'm Julián Zugazagoitia, the Executive Director, and many of you already saw, as we were coming in, that we're preparing for Chinese New Year tomorrow. So it is my pleasure to also wish you a happy Chinese New Year, and we're entering the year of the horse, which is very auspicious, I hear. We will be cavalcading through this program, you'll see. But we're thrilled really to have this program tonight. It is a collaboration with two of Kansas City's finest arts organizations, the Kansas City Symphony and UMKC's Conservatory of Music and Dance. And as you know, this is not the first time that we're collaborating together. Many of you might remember the project that Maestro Stern commissioned when Adam Schoenberg was here visiting the galleries and inspiring himself through our works of art, and then created picture studies that was premiered with the Kansas City Symphony. Also, the Conservatory and the Nelson have been working together for many seasons, and today we're in the 5th season in which the talent of the students and the faculty of UMKC's Conservatory grace our galleries, highlighting the aspects both between music and art. And some of those efforts also transcend partnerships because there's something more personal and philanthropic and also something that gives back to this community. Among those things, and we were just checking that the work was there, I want to celebrate and thank again Maestro Stearns for lending us one of his great works of art, a Picasso head that is today in our modern gallery, but was the cornerstone or the anchor of a small exhibition that we did, Bonjour Picasso, that many of you remember. I guess we were discussing that he has lent us generously on long term so that his daughters do not paint over it. And so we are making sure that it is well conserved and well preserved, and many in this city have been enjoying that generous Picasso in our galleries. So also we have benefited from the support and also many of you are both members here, members of the symphony and supporting, but our leadership, and I see our board members here tonight, many that overshare, like the Rolands and Miss Shirley Bush-Hellsberg, who was a board chair of the symphony and is now our chair. So it is that kind of synergy that makes this city an incredible city, and a city where collaboration among the arts, among science also, universities, come together to make Kansas City the place to be. And it is because of that I think we can bring and celebrate someone with the international figure and repute of John Corigliano. It is really an honor to have you here tonight among us. Thank you. And it is also his involvement with UMKC and inspiring their students that brought him here, and this weekend's the concerts in which his percussion symphony will be premiered or played will be amazing. So it is something that I want all of you to join. Today we will have a conversation that it is to really inspire all of you to go Friday, Saturday and Sunday to the Performing Arts Center, the Kaufman Performing Arts Center, to hear. But with no further ado, let me introduce a very good friend who is the Dean of the Conservatory of Music, Peter Whitty, to introduce formally our guest tonight. Thank you. So please welcome Peter Whitty.
Well, good evening. Collaboration is the stuff of growth, says Sir Ken Robinson, and our time with John Corigliano is proof of concept. Patricia and Howard Barr, the founders of the Barr Institute, spent their lives collaborating as a piano duo, and later with great American composers, especially their friend Paul Creston. Through Patricia Barr's continued generosity, UMKC's Conservatory is able to bring great American composers to Kansas City to connect with our students, faculty, and our community. Stephen Stuckey, Stephen Hartke, 8th Blackbird, and now John Corigliano are our distinguished laureates, drawn to Kansas City in part because of the extraordinary strength of UMKC's composition program, guided collectively and collaboratively by Jim Moberly, Chen Yi, Paul Rudy, and Zhou Long. The conservatory counts among its most treasured relationships our ties with the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art and the Kansas City Symphony. Julian Zugazegordia, Frank Byrne, Michael Stern, and UMKC are all partners in the arts. We ask the question, what if? And with this team, the answer is always, let's try. This audience may recall that here in this very hall, with 8th Blackbird, our previous bar laureate, and then again, as the Birds returned to Kansas City as soloists with the Kansas City Symphony, this first collaboration amongst these three organizations and the Bar Laureate. And again, these collaborations are the stuff of growth. And so it is this year. Our current Bar Laureate, John Corigliano, is a pillar of contemporary American music. He returns for his second visit to UMKC as Bar Laureate, this time with the work Conjuror. And to give you any sense of just what John Corigliano can make happen, he timed it perfectly, as did Michael Stern, because we get to hear it this weekend, and last weekend it was a Grammy winner. Please welcome to Kansas City and to this stage, one of America's pillars of composition and in the arts, John Corigliano. John? Thank you. Thank you. Enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Is this on? Hello?
You're good.
I'm okay?
You're good.
It's great to be back in Kansas City. I love this town, I really do. I have so many musician friends and colleagues and other friends that I've made in my visits here, not just last year, but many years ago when the Kansas City Symphony was conducted by another conductor who performed my first symphony and my piano concerto. So I've been here several times, and every time has been a joy. And in this time, we are having a very special soloist, young soloist, named Martin Grubinger, who, I don't know, he looks 15, but I think he's 29, performing by memory my percussion concerto, which has the title Conjuror. And so I thought I would take that piece and explain to you how I wrote it. Because the question that I get asked most from non-composers is, how do you compose? People understand how you could put paint on a canvas, and people understand how you could type words into a poem or a novel much more clearly than they understand that mysterious thing that exists in time, the dimension of time, which is music. And they say, well, do you get a melody? Do you start with a melody? Is that how it works? Or do you get some rhythmic idea in your head and the rhythms generate some harmonies and melodies? Or is it harmony? Is it chords? Do you pluck chords like many pop people do on the guitar, and over the chords impose a melody and rhythm? And the answer is, it could be any of those things, or other things too. And that's what I'm going to be describing. Because when I write a piece of music, the number of choices open to me to write are just too wide. It's infinite now. Years ago, and if you think of the Romantic period or the Classical period, they had certain ways of speaking and they used certain forms. These forms gave them the ability to start a piece of music and then go to another key and present another theme and then have a development idea and then bring them all back, and gave them this wonderful idea of variety and repetition that we all need in our lives and in our art. And so the music of all ages until the 20th century had similar things about them. Certainly the Baroque period, the Classical, and even the Romantic. But what happened in the 20th century is that a lot of these things were thrown out and weight old forms. We don't want them anymore. We just want to compose with the colors and sounds that we imagine and love. And so it became a time where composers did anything. And I can say anything in the sense that if I had a piano here, I could put my fist on it and say, this is the beginning of my piece, and everybody here would take a nod and say, okay, what are you going to do with that? Or I could just sit in front of the piano and say, this is the beginning of my piece, like John Cage did. Or I could play a C major chord, valid too. Everything's valid. So what do you do? If everything is valid and everything is approachable, how do you make choices? How do you choose what the right notes are to begin a piece? So in Conjuror, the process has to do with many, many things, and I thought I would begin at the beginning. In the beginning, there were many, many attempts by Evelyn Glennie, Dame Evelyn Glennie, who premiered this piece, to get me to write a percussion concerto. Over 15 years, she emailed me, wrote me, bumped into me, and asked me over and over again for one. And I didn't have the heart to tell her why I wasn't going to write one. And the answer was that I don't like percussion concertos. Now, that may seem odd to say, because I'm going to talk about my percussion concerto, but it's true. I really don't like them, and the reason I don't like them is twofold. One is that if you are not watching the percussionist play, if you're just sitting and listening to it, say, on the radio or a CD of it, it usually sounds in a percussion concerto like a piece for orchestra and large percussion section. The soloist is not defined because the soloist plays 200 instruments. I mean, violinists play violins and flutists play flutes, but percussionist plays everything. So there may be a bang of a tam-tam, and then all of a sudden a xylophone riff, and all of a sudden claves and being played, and all by the same person. And it sounds like, in listening to it objectively, an orchestral piece with a lot of percussionists playing. And so how do I define the soloist in this? I'm very attuned to that because my father was a violinist and he played many violin solos and concertos with the New York Philharmonic when he was concertmaster. And I always felt that the soloist has to be clearly defined as the soloist. And in the percussion concerto, there's no definition. The other reason was that the percussion instruments are generally not lyrical, and therefore you can't write a melody on them. There are mallet instruments, they're called, which are the xylophone and the vibraphone and the glockenspiel and the marimba, in which you can play, but the sound dies away because you hit it and it starts to die, and you hit it and it starts to die. So a real melodic feeling, the same thing you would get on a violin, for example, you cannot get. And I wanted to write a concerto in which you could also hear a beautiful melody played by the soloist and not by the cello section with the soloist playing maracas around it, if you see what I mean. So the first thing I had to do was define my problems. And the way I go about it is very often I go to my computer and I type out what I think is wrong and what I think might solve it. And so this very first thing you're going to see is not for audiences to see. I mean, you can see it, but it was for me to see about what I needed to do to fix the problems. Let me get this now. Yeah. Two basic problems, it says on my notes. 1, illuminating the percussionist as a concerto soloist. The variety of instruments, I've got to get over here so I can do this. I can't see it from the side. The variety of instruments played makes focus as soloists difficult. Most percussion concertos sound like orchestral pieces with opulent percussion parts. We just talked about that. Percussion often serves as punctuation and has limited melodic resources, so orchestra often dominates in terms of presenting thematic material, with percussion serving as rhythmic interjection or accompaniment. Those were my big problems with this. How to really make a soloist and how to make the soloist play melodically. So then I went further. I said, okay, lyrical and melodic limits. Mallets, meaning the instruments you play like the xylophone, vibraphone, glockenspiel, etc., that look like a piano keyboard and you play with sticks. They have limits. The sound does die away rather quickly on most mallets. And the timpani can play melodically too, but you wouldn't want to hear a timpani melody. It doesn't really work. For sustained lines, either tremolo or bowed keyboards or bells will work. In other words, you can vibrate a tremolo and continue the line, but I hate that sound. I really do. And so that was crossed off right away from my mind. Ideas on solutions to problems above. And the first idea I had was, let's get rid of about 50% of the orchestra and leave 50% that can have one sound, a homogeneous sound. And what is that 50% of an orchestra? The strings. Because the woodwinds all sound different, the flute, the oboe, the clarinet, the bassoon, and then you've got the brass to contend with, and of course other percussionists. So I said, how about restricting the orchestral palette to set off the multicolored percussionists, so you'd always know when these colorful things happening, it's a soloist. Use of string orchestra alone, often as a homogeneous unit, against the percussion battery delineates the soloist. That's why this concerto is for strings orchestra with percussion soloist. Now you may ask, why did I add brass at the very end of this piece? Because I found in performance that the drumming got so loud near the end that it drowned out the orchestra completely of strings. So what I did was I brought in the brass section to sit until the very end of the piece, where they join and double the strings so that we could hear properly the balance between percussion and the string and brass orchestra. Then I said another one would be restricting the percussion instruments, like write a mallet or marimba concerto. There are lots of marimba concertos written, but I thought that was sort of cheating. You know, I mean, I set out to write a percussion concerto and I ended up writing a marimba concerto because I couldn't really face the issue of how to fix this. So I crossed that off in my mind. Use of separate movements to isolate groups of instruments or categories of percussion. Now this was an interesting idea for me because the percussion is anything. I mean, a Coke bottle can be percussion instrument. You can break a Coke bottle. I think Lucas Foss started a piece with a broken Coke bottle with a towel over it, and that's the beginning of a piece of his. So anything can be percussion, but mostly for the basic percussion instruments, they're either made out of wood or metal or skin. Now, I first thought, what would happen if I did pitched versus unpitched? Let's say I had a movement of in non-pitched instruments like the snare drum and bass drum and all those claves and things like that. And I had that done, and then I had the next movement only pitched instruments. Well, that would be good, but the problem is that a lot of these, I'm getting a ringing here. I don't know if it's bothering anybody else. Yeah. Should I go back to my lectern? Okay, is this better?
Look for the light.
All right, let's do it from here as much as I can. I tend to walk, but I'll control myself. Where was I? Restricting the percussion?
No, wood, metal, and skin.
Oh, well, that the pitched, I said before
This is what the
that,
whole
the
week
pitched
has
and
been like.
unpitched problems.
I swear to God.
And the idea of pitched and unpitched are this. A bass drum has no pitch. You know, a marimba or a xylophone has a pitch. Writing movements for pitch and unpitched. But the trouble is, a lot of what they call unpitched instruments actually have pitches, like tom-toms or things like that. And you can tune them, in fact. So it didn't work out. That was just not going to work out. And that's where I hit upon separating into the basic three elements of percussion. Wood, oops, wrong thing. Wrong thing again. Okay, here it is. Wood, metal, skin, and that became the idea of the concerto. And the ordering of wood, metal, and skin seemed pretty obvious to me because the ones that make the most noise are the skin, the drums. So if you're going to write a piece that's a concerto for percussion, you'd want to end with skin. The ones that hold the sound the longest, believe it or not, are the metal. The vibraphone, the tam-tam, all of these chimes hold notes. The notes do decline in volume, but they hold them much longer, and the ones that hold them the least and are just like clicks and sharp noises are the wooden instruments. And of course, the great wooden instrument, the marimba, has beautiful pitches, but they die away right away. You can't hold them. And then I toyed with other things. I was thinking, well, what about skins and bones? You know, trying to be fancy. And then I was going into bells and whistles. And I thought by that time I had the answer, wood, metal, and skin as the three basic movements of this concerto. All right, that's step one. I'm now going to write a piece with string orchestra that has the first movement only objects of wood in the percussionist, in the second only objects of metal, and the third only objects of skin. Now, I have to expand that into a piece. The first thing that occurred to me was, since I really am going at the idea of this soloist being heard as soloist, was what would happen if I put a cadenza in front of each of those movements for that movement. In other words, before wood, I have a cadenza of only wood instruments. Now, you know, a cadenza is played alone with no accompaniment whatsoever. So the first movement, wood, has a cadenza in front of it. And metal interrupts wood with a huge crash on the cymbals and tam-tam, and has a cadenza for the chimes and other instruments that are metal. And then we go to skin, and now we have the orchestra occasionally perhaps helping a little bit, but we have something called a talking drum and a kick drum. The talking drum and kick drum I'll get to a little later. I just want to show you this is the basic way I outlined it. And this led to this. Now that looks really complex. But what it was I set down to outline the intensity level of the pieces I wanted, knowing that the biggest intensity should be at the very end, but that the interruption of the cadenza here and this here is very intense also. And the smallest intensity, but still of the movement the highest, is here. Now, do you see these dots See them all they're all an inch apart. This is an 11 by 17, actually two 11 by 17 pages glued together. Each dot represents a minute, so I have a sense of proportion. So I know when things get too long or they go by too fast or whatever. So if you look now at the first movement, you'll see up here wood. Am I getting this right? Yeah. Wood. And the original title, Clatter, which no longer exists. The cadenza, and then this is with the orchestra. The line separates them. Now take a look at what I wanted to do in this movement. I wanted the cadenza to start fast and unmeasured, that is not having a beat or measures, completely free for the soloist. And down here, if you can see, I hope you can see on that side, there are two indications of kinds of writing. One is a bunch of notes with a slash through it. When you do that to a lot of notes, it means they are all grace notes, and grace notes means you play it as fast as possible. So if I put that slash and I beam a lot of notes together, the soloist knows go as fast as possible. The other thing is flares up from an eighth note to 32nd notes, and the notes therefore get faster. You start slower and get faster, or start faster and get slower. And then I had the shape of the piece below. Unpitched started it, and then slowly pitched instruments came in, climaxing the piece or this movement with the pitched instruments, and going back to unpitched instruments at the very end when the next movement, which is the next section of the piece, the beginning of the orchestra, comes in. It says rhythmic contour, motive, that I should pick a rhythmic motive that you could hear and develop it. And it is just simply da-dum, da-dum, dum, bum, bum, ba-bum. It's really simple. But when you hear that, and it occurs later, you will recognize it as the motive of the cadenza, which then also gets into this orchestral part too. So we have the cadenza taking place, lasting about 3 minutes. And it gets very soft at the end, and then we have this line, and suddenly the strings start playing, S-T-G-S, strings, piano, as you can see. Now this line, this is not well reproduced in this projection, but it's a bunch of even 16th notes, showing that instead of the acceleration and deceleration and as fast as possible, they're playing da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, even notes. And you see it says fast, measured. These are so you have a sense of rhythm in there that was not in the cadenza. And also, the way you get loud and soft, as you see, or suddenly to get louder and softer, louder and softer. And these are not real in the sense that I didn't make myself do one 20-second this, one 15-second this, one 6-second this. I simply knew that I was going to do the first part of the movement were going to be jolts into loud and then suddenly soft, loud and suddenly soft. And then there was going to be a big build. And at the very big build, the strings were playing wildly and the xylophone tops it all out, and they return down to the original motive, and the marimba plays a little bit of it, original motive in the orchestra, and marimba plays again, and we go into the next movement. That's the first movement. Now notice, I didn't say G sharp or A flat. I didn't say what rhythm. This is all just conceptions of how something can rise to a big climax in the second part, have a different shape in the first part and the second part, and be using the same kinds of material but in different ways. Now we go to the next movement, and what happens is crash. The chimes and the tam-tam come in because we're in metal. That's metal. As you can see, that's where I pasted. That should be a line, because this is the cadenza and this is the part with the orchestra plays. Cadenza, slow, free. Crash, chimes, tam-tam. And notice down here, after they become quiet, it says the violas and low strings continue from the last movement until they're silenced by another crash. And then the chimes start playing a passage that slowly gets softer and softer, and I have a motive of an interval, the fifth, the perfect fifth. If you put your hands on the piano, it would be C and G. That would be the interval. And that interval I used because the melody that I chose in the metal movement is based on fifths as its prime thing. So all through the piece you will hear that same interval, the fifth, being used. Now what happens is, here, a very lyrical melody starting with that fifth from the very lowest note of the marimba plays. And it plays and it goes back and forth and for several minutes. And then it starts to build, and these two ideas trade off, the fifths and the idea of the growing intensity of the piece, until it reaches a crash here and it says chimes enter here with this material. Now I should have really written that up here, but the reason I didn't do that is because I wrote the dynamic down another way. See the piano, P, and the F forte? And it lasts over 4 minutes of basically, when the chimes come in, this is really loud. And the reason I didn't do that was because it gets really soft, and then comes the melody. Now a little bit about this melody. This is the melody I was telling you about that I needed to write, that I finally ended up writing for a very special way of playing the vibraphone. I thought about it, and I thought, what would happen if you hit the vibraphone with the pedal down, and then you took a bow, because bowed vibraphone is very common, and continued the sound with the bow until the next note is hit and the bow then plays, and we get a completely legato melody. Now, I didn't accept the commission for this piece until I had written that melody. I wrote that, and I said, I'll let you know, I'm still thinking about it. And I wrote this melody that had to be ethereal and sublime, and the only thing that accompanies it is, let me see if I can walk over there, or maybe I can, gonna have to walk over. Nope. Here we are. See, it says, okay, now I can read it. VLAS, VC, CB hold chords. The violas, the cellos, and basses way down there hold the chords, while this melody with the fifths is bowed and struck. Okay? And the violins finally end up holding a note. Now notice, this was the high point of the piece, but it didn't look like that. Sometimes the high point of an emotional piece is the softest thing. Let me get back to where I can be louder. And what I did was I built that melody. I remember saying, I want the simplest, most eloquent melody I can find, and then I'll go backwards and write this movement. And I built the melody and the harmony below it, and I didn't want any activity below it. I didn't want the strings to be doing runs or doing some counter melodies or anything. I just wanted them to hold. and change harmony occasionally when the melody requires it. And I worked very hard on that melody, and it goes up to the very highest note of the vibraphone, the high F. And it is based in the key of F. And the thing about the vibraphone is tuned from low F to high F. And so the white keys of the piano are all there, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F. And the black keys are on the other side. And if you want to bow it, you have to lift your bow up and put it on the other side, and you would break the legato. So that means I had to write a melody just because of the instrument and the way it was built and the way it was bowed. I had to write a melody of just the white keys so my bow could stay on the right side of the piece. When I finished that, I called and I said, I'll do the piece. Quite seriously, I remember calling up and saying, I now have a melody for you that will work for the soloist, not for the cellos. And I said, I now feel I can write this piece. And then I started planning all these movements. Now notice at the very end, it says violins, V-L-N-S. Again, this is not, I'm writing this for me, but I know what these mean. It means it holds a high note. Now why does it hold a high note? The same reason that before this, in the movement before, let me see if I can go back. The same reason that there was activity here in the lower strings playing a figure so that the soloist can walk from one place to another, because he's got his wooden stuff on one side of the stage, then he has to walk while they're playing and continuing to the next station and play, and then he's got to walk around the conductor to the last station, percussion, and play. The instruments are spread completely across the stage. So in this one, he has to walk, and what interrupts him is the crash of the cymbals, rather the tam-tam and the chimes, right here. In this one, the violins play a high note, and we go into the next movement. And you'll notice this says slow and free, this says slow, melodic, lyrical. And it was called Shimmer originally, because I had 3 different titles for this piece, and Conjuror was the last one I picked. Okay, here's the high note being held. Let's see what happens. Go to the next movement. There's the high pedal. There's a bunch of things saying low drums. Now, people say to me, do you ever go away from your scheme? Do you ever do something different? And the answer is, usually not. But in this piece, there are 2 differences from this sketch, and they occur, well, there's 2 in this cadenza. One is that I was going to use all the low drums as a cadenza before the orchestra came in. Well, in between that, I discovered an instrument called the talking drum. The talking drum is a really wonderful instrument. It's got a drum head on the top, and then a drum head on the bottom, and it's shaped like an hourglass, like that. And lots of strings attach the 2 heads, the top one and the bottom one. So what happens is, you play that drum and it has a nice low note, and if you squeeze it, because it's shaped like an hourglass, all those strings move in and tighten the note, and the pitch goes, as in talking. And so I decided, I took talking drum lessons to learn how to write for it, because it's finger writing, it's hand writing, as you will see this wizard of a percussionist do with his fingers, the amount of sound he can get and the variety of sound he can get. And I decided he needed also to have a low drum. So there's a thing in pop music called a kick drum. A kick drum is a drum, a little bass drum that you operate by a pedal. boom, 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 boom. You've heard them in a million rock pieces. And they don't last, the boom, boom. They're very short because inside the kick drum is a towel to muffle the reverberations. So it's a low sound that's very sharp. And so this cadenza became a cadenza for talking drum and kick drum played by the same person, which means he's got to squeeze, play with his hands, squeeze with his knees, and with his right foot tap to make this all happen.
Sounds like my days in college.
But then again, this is a virtuoso piece. It's written for a great player, and it's not written for anybody. And so he does that until he reaches a climax. Now the other problem was this high pedal. It got boring for 3 minutes, or 2 minutes. Turned out to be closer to 3 minutes because there's some improvisation in there. So what I ended up doing was I switched the pedal, that is, we call a pedal tone, something that's just held, whether it's high or low. I switched it from one note and then disappeared, and then it appeared again in a low note, and then it appeared in another note and another note and another note and started vibrating and vibrating and finally taking over the energy of the kick drum and the talking drum until boom, the beginning of thunder, pulse, fast. What is that? Oh, a cellorandos. I never had a good handwriting. And you'll hear the crash, you'll know it begins. Crash, second crash, third crash, and it's the entire string section playing with the percussionist these crashes. And what happens is they happen at irregular moments when you don't expect them. They're not in 4/4 time. It's not regular. Boom, 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 boom. And it's very hard to play for the players, but it gives you a feeling of going like that, of darting from side to side. And then it starts to do what I did right in this. It accelerates. This is a cellorondo to a climax. And it just gets faster and faster and faster and faster until it reaches a peak, and actually this is inaccurate. It reaches a peak and suddenly it cuts down and we hear low basses holding a note and the bass drum playing. And from that we get a middle section, which is a bit different than this, but it does have a timpani solo in it that you will hear. And he actually plays the timpani with his hands the same way he played the talking drum, which I've never heard of anybody doing, but he uses the pedal to go woo, doo, 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 and meanwhile he's playing with his hands the timpani to sound like the talking drum. And then he gets back and everything slows down and we get back to the beginning, boom, boom. And this one is even wilder and gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And what happens here is there's a big crash and he plays a little flurry, another clash and a flurry. And here, I didn't put it in because I hadn't thought of it. But here I said, let him play a cadenza. Let him improvise wildly and go completely crazy on all of his. He's got 4 timpanis. What does he have? 6 tom-toms and 2 congas, I think. And to play on all of those instruments going completely crazy, completely wild, and the orchestra finally comes in with the original boom, boom, gets faster and faster, and there's a big crash ending. That's it. Well, you can see that that takes a lot of planning, but and even though I made these changes, like this change and the change over here, the basic shape remains the same, and the highest energy is at the end, so that when you look at the whole map again, you see that no matter how high anything gets, it doesn't get as high as when you're playing on those drums and the orchestra's playing and the brass are playing, and we get to this wild ending. Now, one little detail. The wood section, besides the marimba and the xylophone, There are other instruments made out of wood, and I wanted him to be able to play them with great ease next to the vibraphone, right next to the marimba. So here's the marimba. It's a big instrument, very, very large. And you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 with these images that are changing. Well, they're getting bigger and bigger. And what it is he is to construct a keyboard, a wooden keyboard. And what it says here is the wooden keyboard is a series of 18 instruments in graded pitches from high to low, right to left, of the performer's choosing, which could include the followings. And then I give him choices: claves, woodblock, tempo blocks, castanets, coconut, wood drums, log drums, the big ones. And the reason there were 18 is because if you take our 2 stabs and you take every line and space, it'll come out to 18. So I can actually write for the unpitched instruments, and then right below it have a staff for the marimba. And what he can do is he can start a run here, dip into the marimba, like that. You will hear that. It's a wild sound, because it's all one big run, but it's unpitched, pitched, unpitched, pitched, pitched, unpitched, and pitched, fanned, and it's quite an unusual sound to have. Now I'm going to look at the time. I'm just going to end up showing you the other percussion. These are called percussion stations. This is the one that's on the right side of the stage. And notice I always have what's facing the audience here. Okay? The second one is metal, and the audience is facing, so the audience is out here. And the vibraphone, the chimes, and you see the performer has 3 places he has to stand: here, and then move to here, and then move to here. And he's got a large tam-tam, suspended cymbal, medium tam-tam, and this is pretty standard. They call them trap tables, where they put their mallets, okay? And music stands, notice. Now, he doesn't have any music stands because it's a miracle of miracles. When Martin plays by memory, this entire piece, just think about it. It's like 35 minutes long. He plays it completely by memory and knows every bit of what the orchestra is playing too. So when you see him, you're going to see something really unusual. Anyway, there are crotales here, and is that what that says? I can't read it. I still can't read it.
Crotales.
I think it says crotales. Okay, we go to the next, and skin, and this is just to show you briefly. This is where he walked. The conductor is about here. He is walking over here from playing the metal movement, and they are holding a high note, and here he sits right here, and there's a talking drum here and a kick drum, and he plays the first part of it here, this cadenza, and then with a crash the orchestra comes in, and he plays all these instruments for the rest of the piece. Bass drum, timpanis, 1, 2, 3, 4, and here are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 6 tom-toms and 2 claves. And I gave a little information about hand drumming, because not all percussionists do hand drumming. It's an art that is not really Western. It's an art that comes from places like Africa and the Far East, and so I gave a little notation of C, hit the center of the drum, E, the edge of the drum, C to E, move from the center of the edge. This cross means slap the drum. This means a muffled slap. This means open, muffled, and bass tone, stick in center, strike in center with extra weight. And luckily, Martin plays them beautifully, absolutely beautifully. Now, all that, and then write the piece. Now, I went to that theme in the metal version, and I analyzed the fifths to be used as intervals, and I took some of the ideas of that, and then I started with the very beginning to create a motive that everybody could recognize in the wood section, cadenza, and worked my way through this piece. This takes, a year or a year and a half to do. It's, for me, I'm a very slow composer, so it takes a long time to do this. But in the end, I think the shape of the piece is clear to the audience without my having to tell them all this. I think they feel a shape that makes sense to them. And anyway, it's the way I do it. Not everybody does this. It's very personal, but I find knowing where I'm going is very important. And also saying something very lyrical is important. And I've heard too many percussion concertos that don't have any melodic material for the percussionist, for me not to want to make that the high point of the piece. So that's it. That's the piece. I hope you come to the concert now and hear it, because you will hear everything I spoke about. And if you hear the piece, I think you'll recognize what I was talking about. That's it.
Should I just go up?
Yeah.
Should I just,
You guys right over there. Thank you.
just do it?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Should we go sit down?
Yeah.
It's impressive, standing there. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can appreciate a little bit more what the task of a composer is. I'm Michael, by the way. Just nice to meet you. And it was fascinating for me to be... Whoa. Hello. It was fascinating for me to be sitting here listening to John talk about the map that we have been working on all week and that I have been studying for so long on the page. And before we go to questions from you, and I have some questions for you and also for you, I find it very moving to have you here this week for a lot of reasons. First of all, there are a lot of cross pollinizations, even beyond those that Peter so eloquently talked about. You're absolutely right to call out to Martin. Martin Grubinger is here, ladies and gentlemen. He's right there. Stand up, Martin.
Stand up.
He is a great friend. He's a great friend of the symphonies, and he's a genius player. And any of you who happened to be at the chamber music concert last night at Hellsberg Hall, yes? I know that there was another concert of John's music. There was lots of music in Kansas City, but that was pretty rock and roll. It was unbelievable. And one of the reasons why we feel so close to Martin coming back is that he had been with us already a few years ago, 3 years ago, playing a piece by Avner Dorman, who is also a very, very good friend of mine. And when John was talking about how he sort of goes through the piece and maps it out, this was not foreign to me, having talked to Avner, because Avner studied with John. You also, thanks to Julian's shout out to Adam Schoenberg, you might have enjoyed his picture studies, and we are continuing our long association with Adam, and we're in fact recording a CD of his music this year. And Adam thinks very similarly about music when he maps out a piece. And why? Because he also studied with John at Juilliard. So the fact that you can infect such dynamically, no, in a good way, infect with inspiration and interest and
Infect with inspiration.
you
Can I have this?
yes, you may. And I've checked it for all infectious diseases. The fact that you can be such an inspiration and to have influenced all of these great young people who then turn around and produce more art in this country is something very inspiring. And I also like the fact, not coincidentally, that you have New York connections, that your father was a fiddle player. I'm just, it draws me to you in a,
You bet.
But most of all, I really appreciate the music. When it really comes down to it, it's the music that counts. And John writes music of substance. He writes music that has architecture and shape. And it's interesting because when I was choosing what we could put on the rest of the program to showcase his wonderful concerto, I did think of Beethoven for three reasons. One is that Beethoven is, of all the composers,
The supreme architect.
the supreme architect, and especially the Fifth Symphony. And the other thing was that knowing that Peter and the conservatory had extended this invitation to John to be the Bar Laureate, I was eager to whet the appetite, so to speak. And so 2 weeks ago, those of you who were there, before we played the Beethoven Seventh Symphony, we played his wonderful Fantasia on an Ostinato, which is, of course, based on the second movement, or inspired by the second movement of the Beethoven Seventh Symphony. So there is this, I don't think that Beethoven sat down at his computer and mapped out the Fifth Symphony. He did not. I'm pretty sure he did not. But there is something
Have you seen
very...
the sketches, though?
I have seen the sketches. I'm just making the point that it wasn't on a MacBook Pro with 16 gigs of
That
RAM.
was a pencil.
Or with a pen. Okay, I'm... Yes, and yet now I understand that John is very old world, so he actually composes with a pencil, which is also one of the things that could endear me to him. But the idea that there should be structure and order, and in that a space for real improvisation and, as you said, lyrical communication with the audience is completely in evidence. And the last thing I'll say before we talk directly to John about the things that matter most to him is that when you study this piece, and I think Martin would agree, you really have to understand the intent behind the notes. So you get, I mean, I've done so much contemporary music. I have a lot of mileage, and I'm devoted especially to American music. And yet, and on top of that, I used to be music director of a radio orchestra in Germany where one of the central missions was to do as much contemporary music as possible. And you would get these scores where clearly there was no fundamental reason, for understanding the piece. I mean, there's a term in German called Augenmusik. It's music for the eyes. And you see things on the page and it's busy, and why? Why? When you look at John's scores, you can really try and devote yourself with all of your energy to understanding why he wrote it, because there's going to be a reason. And there's going to be, and what was fascinating to me this week was this wonderful take between Martin, who has played the piece, but this is the first time for you who have heard the piece many times, but it's the first time with Martin, and he and I having discussed what we would find in the piece, and then having you bring back your perspective, and seeing all of those pieces come together was an inspiring and truly wonderful moment. And when you feel the piece and the way the piece is constructed and the momentum that is engendered, you really understand that from the beginning there is going to be an inevitable, an ineffable ending, which is going to bring us to this conclusion, and it's all going to be of one thing, and that's a beautiful thing. So bravo for that, and I would urge everybody who has any appetite whetted by the idea of figuring out what the hell do they mean by putting the crotales there and the claves there, come and hear it, because it really is worth hearing. Number one, would you ever write a second percussion concerto, or are you intrigued by, I'm not saying that to upset you, but the fact that you didn't want to for so long, and then this idea that you could write lyrically, you found the melody, it inspired you to do so, has it opened up more possibilities, or?
I wouldn't write a second percussion concerto. I never write a second anything. And I mean, I have 3 symphonies, but they're scored completely differently. The first is for full orchestra, the second is for strings alone, and the third is for wind ensemble, which is every single thing but the strings, all the winds, the brass, and the percussion. So even though they're called symphonies, they're totally different. I've written concertos. I have 9 or 10 concertos, all for different instruments, all derived from reasons of, I ask myself, why am I writing this piece? What is this piece to do? Why am I going to do this? And I have to find that out before I can start. So I think when I solve a problem like the percussion concerto, I will move on to another problem of a different kind, with a whole different reason for being. Not that I don't love this. Now I like percussion concertos.
Since he mentioned it, the First Symphony, which is sometimes nicknamed the AIDS Symphony, is truly a brilliant piece. The Second Symphony, which I have done, won the Pulitzer Prize, did it not?
Mm-hmm.
And what I really appreciate tremendously, and if you look at the Second Symphony, which is scored only for strings, which by definition then means that the color palette, the sonorities that are used are by definition more limited, right? You're only writing for one group of instruments. Which means that the responsibility for the piece to hang together in this architectonic way is more important. In fact, that piece is exploding with color. I mean, if you do it right, I think. And of course, it's interesting because you grew up at a moment of the 20th century where music was starting to infiltrate in other areas. I know that you worked, not that this had necessarily a huge impact on your writing, but you actually worked on the Young People's broadcast, or the televised broadcast that Lenny Bernstein did. You worked closely with that. You have scored wonderful music for films, Altered States, right? Mm-hmm. The Red Violin, which was a great score.
Thank you.
And it was a score that we played here with Josh Bell playing. And there's always this idea of inherent drama in the music. Talk about that a little bit in terms of what a 21st century composer can do to expand that palette and still stay true to the idea of communicating through music something which in some way reflects our world.
Well, I feel that music, even a symphony, sonata form is a dramatic form. You take one kind of music, of theme, and you impose it against a completely different one, and they fight it out in the development, and then when they finally come back, the coming back is the most marvelous part of most symphonies. When they recapitulate back, it's so inventive. I think all music is dramatic, but I believe in getting very close to my music and wanting people to see me that way. Some composers want a little bit of distance, and they want the sense that the music exists almost like Baroque music in a kind of beautiful image. I'm thinking of certain kinds of minimalism that don't evoke emotional responses so much as the sense of a constantly beautifully changing kaleidoscope, for example, that goes like this and is constantly changing and so beautiful. So not all composers write with this, but I do. I write really wanting to get to the emotional center of something, but also wanting to have the piece have something for the audience to be able to hear and understand. And I understand that the first time they hear it, they'll hear 3% of that, just like they would in a Beethoven piece. But it's like an onion, peeling an onion. If you hear it again and again and again, hopefully there's more to hear. And I like to layer my pieces that way.
Well, I think, one of the definitions of great music, of any great art, actually, not of any visual art, any musical art, is the fact that if it works, it's accessible on any level. So if you have someone who really is coming to a first time, it's wonderful to see the reactions of children to a piece of music or to looking at a piece of art where they've had limited life experience or limited exposure to other things, and if they get it deep. But then, the more you know, the more you can discover, which is why a great piece of music, can sustain you all your life and still not get to the core of it. Mm-hmm. There are certain pieces where I don't think, and I've done them, unfortunately, I have to admit, and I still don't think I really understand them. The Grosse Fuge of Beethoven jumps to mind. I mean, you can spend a lifetime trying to figure that out. But on the surface, the most easily approachable thing in music is always rhythm, right? And one would think, and I say this to all of you who have not yet heard the concerto, one would think that a concerto written for percussion would be almost entirely driven by rhythmic impulse. Now, clearly there is a lot of rhythm in the piece. By definition, there has to be. But it's actually not where the spark of the piece is. The spark of the piece is not in the rhythm, in the same way that I hate to say it, but this was on my mind. Actually, I don't hate to say it at all. I'm happy to share this with you. It's one of the reasons why I chose Beethoven's Fifth Symphony to complement the program, because everybody thinks, oh yeah, da-da-da-dam, there's that rhythm, right? And the whole piece is just da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-dam, it's rhythm. It's not just rhythm. The whole point of Beethoven's Fifth is not rhythm, and yet the rhythmic propulsion of that piece is a designing element of it, but it's not where God lives in the piece. And similarly, the opening piece that we have on the program, which is all sort of mariachi, let's drink enough to get to the verb at the bottom of the bottle, kind of, let's have a little party, which is very rhythmic, is also not the only thing about that piece. So rhythm sort of guides the whole program, but certainly, and as you said, beautifully in the hands of Martin, who really is one of the most extraordinary colorists and imaginative musicians I've ever worked with. There is all of this possibility, right, in the music, which is really, it's fantastic. Some people say that music is dead in the 21st century, classical music anyway. Do you believe that?
Absolutely not. In fact, I think that especially because of the accessibility of music now, with iTunes and other things, I think that we have a bigger audience than we used to have. And I think that we're never going to be pop, and we shouldn't try to be. We should try to be what we are, which is to write music that speaks to people who want to hear a message in the language that we'd like to write. And there has to be a message. There has to be a message, and I think audiences are there. Every time I go to a different city, I see these audiences really loving music. And they are, by the way, the people that keep us nourished. Because if you don't know it, the audience is very important to the composer, because it's a very isolated thing we do. We go in a room and we work for 2 years or a year and a half on a piece. And then if the audience brings us back and gives us back some of that idea of the love of music, we're nourished and we can go and write another piece. Without that, the thing isn't complete. It has to be that two-way street. And so I thank you all for that.
Let me ask if any of you have questions for John. Are you willing to take a question? Yes. You're about to, whether you're willing.
How does writing for voice or opera vary from that process?
Did you all hear the question? No. How does writing for voice or opera vary from the process that he described?
Well, you have words. Those pesky things, you know. If you are a composer who cares about the words, what you really do, like I tried to do with Dylan Thomas, who I've set an entire evening of his music in a giant, you should do that sometime, the Dylan Thomas trilogy.
I know.
All Dylan Thomas. What I do is I read the words and then I type them out triple spaced, and then I find the architecture in Dylan Thomas's writing, and he leads me into lyrical passages, into wild, frenzied passages, into serene things that you can't imagine. So words are terribly important. Now in opera, you're dealing with one more addition, and that is the idea of a plot and an opera company who at this point is very interested in knowing whether your opera is going to be a success. So while you're writing it, they're very interested in it. And it's a little bit halfway between writing film music and concert music, in the sense that the director and the music director are much more interested while you're writing an opera than a symphony conductor would be when you're writing a symphony. He will simply wait till he gets the symphony and then open it up and take a look at it. They want to be involved in the process from the start, from the beginning of the libretto, changing it, doing things like that. That's the difference. Writing for the voice is natural to me. I try to sing what I can of what I write, but I mean it's the most natural thing, because it's the first thing we all do, is make sounds with our voice. So knowing the voice, now knowing there's particular breaks and where to avoid and all that is important. And the composer, just like he has to know that in a clarinet, he has to know that in a voice. And writing for particular voices is another matter, because there are some people who have extraordinarily and strange gifts. I mean, we would never have the Queen of the Night aria if there wasn't some woman way back then who could pop off high Fs, you know, and if she didn't exist, that piece would not exist. It was written specially for a person. And that's a wonderful thing too. Of course, Mozart worked on a very fast schedule. So unlike mine, when I wrote The Ghost of Versailles, all the people I originally thought were going to be in it either died or gave up. It's true. Not a good omen.
Oh, you set me up for such a good joke, but I'm going to restrain myself. Yes, ma'am.
Well, where do you write, or what kind of place is it, or can you describe it?
Yes, I write upstate New York. I have an apartment and I have a room I can write in, but it's so noisy in New York, and I live on the fire engine block, which means every 15 minutes there's a siren.
There are a lot of fires in New York.
There's a lot of people who like to make those sirens go up and down with no fire or a fire.
I'm surprised that you didn't put one of them in the percussion concerto.
I have it in my third symphony. I have 2 sirens. But upstate, where I have the most beautiful studio overlooking a lake with no houses on it, and a waterfall, and a Bechstein piano, and real beauty, that's where I do my work. And I mean, it is the perfect studio for me. I mean, I've built it to be exactly the way I want it, and it's where I can do it, if I can do it.
Couple more? Sir.
Do you use computers at all in writing, or do you strictly use the piano, or all in your head?
Piano, if it's harmonic, all in my head, if it's textural. So sometimes I'm away from the piano and I lie on a bed with a pillow over my head so I can't hear anything else. I just try to envision what these sounds are like. If there are clusters moving down to this and blending with this, you can't write that in piano. And if it's a melody and a harmonic world, then I use the piano. So it's either way.
Why no computer?
Because I can't remember all those commands. Simple. That's the reason.
You know, it's a really fair question. I mean, I shouldn't say this absolutely, because I'm sure I've been proven wrong, but sometimes you can tell when music is written on a computer. There's something, creating art shouldn't be easy, unless you're Mozart, where he just like sat down and page after page of perfect, error-free manuscript came out of his pen. But there should be some inherent struggle in art. There's a noble pursuit. It's like practicing your instrument or writing a book. And when I was a young conductor, John Harbison, whom of course you know,
Yeah, sure.
took me aside and he said, you know how you should study a score? You should take empty staff paper and write out every single note of that piece by hand. And I promise you that when you finish writing that out, you will know every note of that score better than if you had studied it. Now, I feel like I'm fairly fluent in music. I can look at a piece of a page of music and hear it, and I'm thinking, wow, That would take a lot of time. And he said, why should you think arrogantly that you can spend less time learning the piece than I spent writing it?
Good.
And that has stuck with me always. I mean, it's not practical and it's kind of impossible, but there is something to it. And a lot of composers, you're not the only person who holds a pencil. And the act of actually putting ink or, charcoal to the paper and writing notes. My old teacher used to say, why are you ignoring that fortissimo with an accent and a dash on the note? Beethoven could have just written the note. He took the time to write the two Fs, to write the accent, and to write the dash. If he took the time to write it, you look at it. He was very German. Sir.
Two questions, actually. The first is, it's so exciting seeing your visual approach to conveying or the narrative in your process. And how over time has your process changed, if it has? And then the second question, when you hear other compositions, do you visually track that narrative in your thinking?
Did everyone hear the questions? Yes?
Well, first of all, when I hear other music, I try to make sense of it, which is tracking things, but I don't try to make sense in such a way that I miss what's happening emotionally. So sometimes the first hearing, I will let the emotional side of my brain take over and love the piece or not love the piece. And then when I love the piece, I look further and hear it again and get to know all the incredible things that the composer did. And I forget your first question.
This process that you showed us today changed dramatically.
Well, it changed into this. This is the final product. I didn't used to do this. But then again, when I started composing, I used traditional forms. My piano concerto and things like that are, first movement is a big sonata allegro form and all of that kind of doings until I think 1975 I started thinking differently, and I wrote my oboe concerto, and I started saying to myself, am I being inhibited by those 5 lines and that staff paper and that bar line? Are they inhibiting me from thinking of sounds that I could think of? And I started thinking of sounds that I loved and even drawing them on, with colored pencils and saying, maybe I can devise another way of notation that is playable and at the same time expresses that. For example, in The Ghosts of Versailles, it starts out with this descending, actually 12-tone row because I wanted it to be chromatic. So it's descending and descending like that, and then it's moving this way and this way. And what happens is I've given that to 8 instruments to play and a synthesizer with a very thin sound. And the 8 people are supposed to finger it or bow it, but don't touch the bow to the strings until ad lib they decide to make a crescendo from niente to piano to niente, so that it colors a sound at places that I would never know, but I picture it as cigarette smoke curling upwards, where you see the thickness of the smoke and then it kind of disappears for a moment and then it changes into a wave. That's how I started thinking of music, and that changed a lot in my writing. And Altered States was a big help in that because I was able to, in film music, ask for anything I wanted. I wanted 2 pianos tuned in quarter tones. Sure, no problem. You ask a symphony orchestra about that, and they're going to say, well, what do you want us to do? Hire another pianist and tune a piano down, and
Well, if you're writing for the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Symphony,
Yeah, they don't care. They're
it's Hollywood.
Happy. They're perfectly happy to do anything you want. So you can really experiment with things. And Altered States, I don't know if you know it, but it was Ken Russell's movie and William Hurt's first movie. And it's actually a cult film. It's really got a huge musical score that I wrote. And in that, I learned a lot of techniques by just sitting down and writing on the top of a page, motion, sonority. Is there something I can get by a single symbol that will give me a great deal of motion, like a trill does or a tremolo does? If you write just TR, you get a lot of action. If I tremolo, you get action. Can I write other symbols that can give me a flurry of activity with a symbol rather than writing 85,000 notes and having the players do it when all I want is a cluster of sounds boiling? And I devised a lot of techniques for the film that I then brought over into my concert world and use to this day.
Let's talk about one of them. One of them is the boxes, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so in a lot of John's scores, there are these boxes. So you'll have a box, and then a line, and then a box, let's say, if that's one of them. And the box, it's a little bit like you can't have true freedom without some discipline. So the discipline is the box. He gives you the choices of pitches with which to play with. And then the randomness is up to you. And the randomness is sometimes done individually, person to person, on all the stands in the string section. So you've got complete randomness, but it's not complete chaos because you've defined the parameters. Yeah.
I have two notes, and you can play, including those notes, you can play from that note to and including that note as fast as possible. Or you can play it depends. If I just have the box, it's a half-note cluster, and the copyist has to write that out. If I put one line, just like eighth notes, it's all in eighth notes. If I have two, it's 16th. But if I put three, it's play as fast as possible, and I just draw a line until I want it to stop. And it's tremendous activity. I mean, it sounds like boiling, absolute boiling, and it's a very easy for the players, and they get the real message of what I wanted, which is I didn't want them to play A flat, G, B, F, F sharp. I didn't want those notes. I wanted them to scramble between those notes. So this is the way I chose to define that.
I have to say it's also very liberating because we at the symphony, all musicians, and Martin will corroborate this, we spend a lot of time trying to get things together, right? You want things to be right. You want things to be ordered. And then he writes in his concerto, play asynchronously. So you have every member of the cello, viola, and violin sections playing one line up, and they're not supposed to play together. And they're like, what? They find their fingers actually falling in the same place as other people's, and that's exactly not what's supposed to happen. To try to liberate yourself from what you're used to is sometimes a little bit scary.
Worst thing to do is to tell players not to play together. They're so used to playing together. But I write a run, a very chromatic run all the way up, and I start it in the basses, and I add the cellos and violas and seconds and firsts going all the way up. And I put that slash through it that I showed you at the beginning. That means everybody plays as fast as possible. And they play those notes, and when they're finished, they stop. And either diminuendo to nothing or crescendo, something can happen in there. And what you get, it's like nude descending a staircase. I don't know if you've ever seen the picture of the many, it's like a strobe capturing of the nude descending the staircase. You get the following of all the voices making a cloud of sounds that go up that are all those notes.
Was your improvisation borrowed at all or influenced by jazz?
Did you all hear that? Was the idea of improvisation in John's music inspired by jazz?
Not really. I used to play jazz when I was young, and I used to improvise when I was young, and I really regret that I somehow stopped doing that because I got a lot of pleasure out of it. And I love jazz, but the interesting thing is that, for example, Aaron Copland wrote some jazz pieces in the 20s, his piano concerto and music for the theater and things like that. But Leonard Bernstein told me that he thinks the most interesting aspect of the absorption of jazz into Aaron Copland is not his jazz pieces, but his other pieces in which those kinds of intervals and those kinds of rhythms come out naturally as part of Aaron Copland's speech. So of course I have jazz in me, and it comes out, but I don't consciously make that happen.
Before we take that question, I do want to ask Martin about improvisation, because one of the great, oh yeah, I'm calling you out, kiddo. One of the really exciting moments, there are many exciting moments in doing this piece, this great piece, is when there is a section for the soloist to improvise, and he gets going, and he goes into this zone, and you feel he's levitating, you're levitating, you know, there's this kind of thing, and you're in this zone, and you're not, you know, you're waiting for the hook. There is a hook that I have to listen for, but until it comes, he's just. Talk to us a little bit about having the freedom to do that in a piece, because it's probably not the first percussion concerto that was called for.
Hello, everybody. So, Mr. Corigliano is quite, let's say, focused on what he wants to hear. So, as you saw on the score, that he wants to listen and wants to see the soloist playing in the center, on the edge of the drum. So he wants to have slap. He wants to see the player play with the stick, with the fingers, muffled, and all these things. And of course, you're free to improvise, but he wants to see the structure, the rhythmical structure of the first movement also in the improvisation. So, of course, you can be in a way creative, but on the other hand, you have to stay focused, and you have to stay, and you have to remind yourself that the structure, the rhythmical structure, has always to be there. And the funny thing is, of course, that sometimes as a percussionist, you want to express your emotion, your love to the piece, and it's a fantastic piece, it's real fun. And of course the pulse is at 190, and you really think now you can give everything, and sometimes of course you lose control of yourself, and you do what you want. But I try to control myself, and I hope very much to make Mr. Corigliano happy tomorrow.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Yes, ma'am.
In the red violin, you too have pointed the technical and other expressive possibilities of the violin. So what came to me is that a great violin and how? That's one question. You could take lessons from you there. And the other one is when you wrote it, did you have Joshua Bell specifically in mind, or did you actually work with him?
Well, the first answer is my father didn't want me to be a musician, so he wouldn't give me violin lessons or encourage my composing or do any of that. But I heard him practice, and I learned a lot by just hearing how the violin moves and how the fingers move, so that I feel I can write idiomatically for the violin without necessarily going to books or studies or things. If I have some really strange chords that I do, I call up friends who play the violin. I say, okay, get your violin now. Bottom note is this, the next note is this, the next note is this, the next note is this. Can you play that? But basically, I inherited, with good fortune, my father's love for the violin and his. And I heard all the things he did, all the repertoire, all the bowings of the symphony. He used to sit and play all the bowings of all the symphonies. As the concertmaster, he had to do that, all the Brahms and Beethoven works. So I basically learned from that. And the second question was...
Did you have Josh in mind?
Oh, well, Josh was actually hired for this project before I was. So it's not that I had in mind. I was very happy to hear that he was, because he's a superb violinist and he's a perfectionist, which I am too. And so we could both hone in on something, and if they say, no, we have no time for this, the two of us can put up a good argument for why we have to have time for this. We started recording in London, and he didn't like the mics. And he ended up using some old RCA mic that they got way in the back that had a really beautiful sound that he got. And they tried on mics during the recording session because he wasn't happy. So I love that kind of sense of discipline, and he plays that way too. We didn't collaborate much. Don't forget, he's jetting around the world all the time. So we got together when he needed to record something of mine, and there was a pre-recording in the movie because anytime you film anybody moving their hands, you have to have the music first and then sync up the hands. So there was a first period where we did this, and then there was a period later when he played this red violin chaconne of mine in San Francisco. And then I wrote him 3 more movements, and we have now a 4-movement violin concerto, which he recorded and played. And I mean, there are 2 other recordings of it. Josh is just magnificent. And he didn't, I didn't see him till 3 weeks before the premiere, and he was opening up the music, and he came out to the country house. And, you know, I'd worked so hard on it, and he had it for 6 months. And I got really testy on it, I have to admit. Because, you know, I worked so hard on it, and he's opening it up and saying, what is this, and what is that? And I said, Josh. And I said, you know, and then he tried to play it, and I said, well, the violinist friend of mine plays this better. He said, maybe you should have him play it. And, you know, it's one of those moments that you don't want to be around, you know. And then he left on his Porsche, and off he was. And then he played the piece so beautifully that I wrote him an email saying, okay, if you can do that in 3 weeks, I apologize, I take back everything I said. That's my story with Josh.
What a perfect segue, because now that, again, your appetite is whetted, Josh will be with the symphony in March. I think there's some tickets still available. And we did the red violin here. We did it 6-7 years ago here, and I did the whole concerto with him at Aspen also, so that's a great piece too. Ladies and gentlemen, this was incredibly fun. Does anyone have any burning question? I think we need to wrap up. Is it burning?
Why did your father discourage your interest in music?
Because he wanted me to make a living. Thank you. Let's end.
That's good. I think we'll agree that he did make a living, right? It's an honor having John here this week. He is fantastic. He's been fantastic with the students. It's great having him at the symphony, and tonight was very special. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well done, sir. Good.